Hi everyone, I'm Amy, and I'm going to be giving a lecture on thinking about economy and society in the time of COVID-19. Um, so you, like me, may have spent the last few months waking up to a steady stream of announcements from both federal and provincial levels of government here in Canada, involving things like expanded income supports for the newly unemployed or the furloughed, wage subsidies for private employers, emergency government funding for food banks, government investments in COVID-19 research, and here in British Columbia, provincial management of the staffing of long-term care facilities and pay raises for frontline healthcare workers. We've also learned of government contracts and orders for personal protective equipment. We've learned that the government has stockpiles of emergency supplies like face masks, and speculative buying and selling of critically needed supplies like face masks, personal protective equipment, or even toilet paper has been criticized as morally reprehensible. And there has even been emergency legal restrictions placed on some of this speculative economic behavior. Banks and other lenders have also been asked to allow borrowers to temporarily suspend payments on mortgages and on credit card debt. So you put all this together and you can see that clearly these are unprecedented times. And public health measures, which have required limiting or even shutting down certain businesses, have had a profound impact on our economy. But can we think about the economy and the health of the economy as something separate from the health of our population? How should we think about the relationship between society, the state, and the economy? And what should the government's role in the economic realm be? And I would also ask, do these extraordinary times offer us some more general insights into these kinds of questions? So I want to suggest to you in my short lecture today that the disruptions associated with COVID-19 have revealed both the importance and the limitations of markets in our lives and in our society. So in order to do this, in order to think about markets and society from our current circumstances, I'm going to first take a step back and introduce you to a set of 4 ideas that I'm borrowing from Karl Polanyi, who was a scholar who wrote during an earlier period of great upheaval. So Karl Polanyi was a Hungarian economic historian who is probably best known for a book he wrote about the transformation of the economy and of society from the late 19th to the early 20th centuries. This book, The Great Transformation, is effectively an effort to understand the causes of World War I, the rise of fascism in Europe, and then the subsequent Second World War. So in writing this book, Polanyi developed a framework for thinking about the relationship between the economy, the state, and society. And I think this framework is useful for thinking about our contemporary circumstances, both prior to the current situation as well as now during this pandemic. So I'm going to borrow 4 ideas from Polanyi based on an interpretation of his work by 2 American sociologists, Fred Block and Margaret Summers. The 4 ideas are, first, the threat that markets can pose to society. Second, the idea of fictitious commodities. Third, the double movement. And finally, the economistic fallacy. So what I'm going to do is I'll explain each one of these ideas briefly, and then I'll try and demonstrate for you why I think each one is a useful sociological tool for making sense of our present circumstances. So first, the first idea is that markets, while necessary, are important. They're both necessary and important, but they also pose a threat to society. And Polanyi studied the causes, in his study of the causes of World War I and then fascism and then World War II, this study led him to believe that when markets are allowed to dominate society, they can threaten important social institutions that make up civil society and that bind us together as a collective. Polanyi was particularly interested in efforts leading up to the 20th century to create liberalized free markets in the name of efficiency and prosperity. Polanyi's investigations led him to believe that when improperly or insufficiently regulated by society, markets take things that are essential to life and commodify them in corrosive ways. That is, markets treat things that are essential to life primarily as goods to be bought and sold in the marketplace. And when this happens, the result can be human suffering, and the destabilization of social and political institutions. So you can probably think of examples of problems that result when certain things that are necessary for human life and social participation, are commodified. Education, healthcare, clean water, clean air, even food. Treating these things as simply commodities can result not only in some grievous injustices, but it can also disrupt the stability of society and even the stability of the market. So to put this in somewhat simpler terms, markets do not necessarily value the things that societies need or that societies value, and it doesn't distribute them according to those needs. So I would argue that our current experiences with COVID-19 and the global pandemic have shined a very bright light on the fact that certain things cannot be simply thought of as commodities, and that we cannot leave the production, distribution, and use of these things to market mechanisms only. An excellent example would be human labor, which is something that Polanyi labeled a fictitious commodity. So for Polanyi, a fictitious commodity is something that was never created to be bought and sold on the marketplace, but which is treated as a commodity in market contexts. And labor is probably the clearest example of a fictitious commodity. Labor is human life itself, and treating labor as nothing more than a commodity can result in tremendous social suffering and upheaval. We already recognize this, which is why social welfare systems like Canada's include unemployment insurance. And now that vast numbers of people who once relied on the labor market for employment and are now employed, now the provincial and federal governments in Canada have stepped in to provide basic income to these unemployed. This is effectively a recognition that people can't be treated like commodities. So even though the collapse of market mechanisms in the current context comes from a disruption that's external to the market itself, nevertheless, I think it highlights or reveals the potential fragility of relying too heavily on the market for the necessities of life. I'm sure that you can think of or imagine the human suffering that results from treating labor as merely a commodity, and we see that in our own societies. The current circumstances have been so extreme that the state swiftly moved in to substitute for the market. But the essential issue is that the need for a livelihood is true for everyone, whether you are employed or unemployed, whether you are able to sell your labor to an employer or you're not able to. The idea that labor is simply a commodity is, of course, a fiction, and the state has to take actions to make that fiction sustainable over time. Okay, so let me just repeat my first 2 points. First, we need markets. They're an important mechanism through which we express individual choice, but markets can also threaten social well-being, particularly through the commodification of things that arguably should be treated as things everyone is entitled to, things that are necessary for human life and social participation. So that's the first idea. The second idea, I offered you the example of labor as a fictitious commodity, as an example of the tension between the commodification processes found in markets and the needs of human society. These two ideas were important elements of Karl Polanyi's analysis of economy and society, and I think they hold great relevance to the current situation. Closely related to these first two ideas, the idea that markets have an inherent potential to disrupt society, and that some things cannot and should not be treated as commodities. In addition to those two ideas, Polanyi also argued that when markets do cause disruption and hardship, people will organize themselves in self-protective ways. This can take the form of revolutions or political movements, civic campaigns, social organizations, the formation of labor unions, or government policies. Polanyi's term for this protective movement against market disruption is the double movement. So you have a movement in what he was studying was efforts to create liberal or free markets, and then he saw a counter movement to protect society from the effects of those markets. So the rise of the modern welfare state is actually associated with the profound disruptions caused by the Great Depression. And it's an excellent example of the double movement because it was an effort to counter the negative effects of a very volatile and speculative capitalist economy at the time. So Polanyi saw the double movement, as I noted, as reactions against attempts to free markets from the constraints of social and political institutions and oversight. So a somewhat different framing or use of the concept. But I think we can use this concept in our contemporary context as well. We see many forms of the double movement as governments and ordinary people attempt to simultaneously address the pandemic as well as the economic disruptions associated with those public health efforts. As I mentioned a moment ago, the massive expansion of income supports from Canada's federal government represents not only a recognition that people and their livelihoods are not simply commodities, but it also represents an effort to protect the social fabric of society from the consequences of profound economic disruption. Government efforts have taken on unprecedented forms, extending far beyond individual income support to include wage subsidies to employers, rent support for small businesses, and more. So, of course, the Canadian government is not seeking to permanently replace the market, and much of this effort is in order to allow the market to be quickly reconstituted when things go back to so-called normal. But nevertheless, this level of government involvement in the economy shows how false the idea that markets are somehow autonomous from other parts of society is. Indeed, there's a social fabric that holds all of this together. So I think these efforts have raised questions about how we organized our economy and our society before the pandemic and what we might change going forward. So just as an example, the crisis of care provision in long-term care homes, especially in Ontario and Quebec, has raised questions about whether care for our elders should be organized on a for-profit basis. And people have started asking that question. Should the objective in these settings be to keep labor costs to a minimum? What happens when the state steps back from its regulatory role in these settings, as has happened in Ontario? Many have argued that, in fact, these problems long predate the COVID-19 pandemic, but the current health crisis has thrown a harsh spotlight on largely ignored problems, and problems that you could easily argue are rooted in a kind of market organization. When markets do threaten important aspects of society, so for example, the provision of dignified and humane care, then we can expect some kind of double movement, be it in the form of advocacy organizations lobbying for policy change, which I think predates the pandemic, or in the current situation, families picketing outside of care homes and more direct and immediate intervention by the state. So the double movement is an important element of the relationship among the market, states, and society. So I've offered you 3 ideas to work with so far. The idea that markets, especially markets not subject to sufficient social or political oversight, cause social disruptions. Second, that this disruptive effect of markets is especially visible with so-called fictitious commodities like human labor. And third, that when disruptions happen, there is often a self-protective response by society, or the state on behalf of society, called the double movement. Let me offer you one more idea from Polanyi to work with. One of Polanyi's key insights was that society and its institutions are the foundation upon which the economy is built, and as a result, the economy is dependent on those institutions. The economy, in other words, is embedded in social, cultural, legal, and political institutions. Polanyi also argued that the economy the point of the economy is to sustain human life. It's how we organize and produce the things we need to live the lives that we imagine for ourselves. This means, he argued, that our economies should be organized to serve those needs. But it's often argued, I think you'll notice, that society must be organized in ways that promote the economy and serve the needs of the economy. This is a very common framing of how we think about the economy. This idea that the economy and the needs of the economy are what shapes human society is what Polanyi called the economistic fallacy. Polanyi believed that thinkers on both the right and the left ends of the spectrum subscribe to this mistaken view that the economy dictates the rest of human society and not the other way around. In fact, Polanyi argued, the economy is embedded in social, cultural, and political institutions that are fundamental to its functioning. As a result, we in fact have considerable agency over how we organize our economies, and we do not need to treat ourselves as subordinate to the so-called needs of the economy. What is more, Polanyi argued that we can and should subordinate the market to democratic oversight. I think we can see the economistic fallacy operating now when debates about public health restrictions on the one hand are positioned against the health of the economy on the other. If we adopt Polanyi's insights, we can see that it doesn't make sense to oppose public health to the health of the economy, because of course, the economy is dependent on our collective health. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't have meaningful debates about restrictions on the economy, how fast those restrictions should be lifted, and so forth. But it does mean that it shifts the conversation in important ways, and it allows us to view the economy as serving our individual and collective needs, and not some independent, autonomous needs of the economy. So I want to end with a final set of observations. One takeaway from my introduction to you of Karl Polanyi's ideas could be that the economy is deeply embedded in society, and that the economy should not be understood as having interests or needs separate from those of society. They are integrated. Today, a public health crisis has led governments around the world to step up and ensure that people have access to the things necessary for life and society: food, housing, medical care, and more. We might ask, will this extraordinary time change how we think about these necessities in the future? Will we recognize them as universal needs, as entitlements, as opposed to as goods that get distributed primarily and or even only through market mechanisms? Second, we might also borrow Polanyi's concept of the double movement and apply it more narrowly to public health crises. So just like markets, global pandemics can similarly threaten society. I think Polanyi would have argued that complex problems, like a pandemic, require the coordinated action by government, and that a society with a robust democracy is most likely to have a government that will pursue solutions that can truly address collective needs in socially just ways. You could argue that we need a broader double movement to address not only the current, but also future pandemics. And in fact, some scientists are already arguing that market mechanisms oriented towards short-term profit-taking are poorly equipped to address long-term public health concerns. Markets are also unlikely to prioritize the public good. But as we also see with the differential impact of COVID-19, with some groups dying at much higher rates than others, government action requires democratic, inclusive oversight in order to produce socially just outcomes. We can't just assume that the state always acts in the collective good. And in fact, that's often one of the arguments for letting markets make these decisions. Finally, while our focus here is the current pandemic, you might consider that these concepts, so the market as necessary but potentially threatening, fictitious commodities, the double movement, and the economistic fallacy, all of these concepts can be applied to questions related to environmental sustainability as well. And they're relevant to how we think about climate change. And you can imagine, right, markets as threatening environmental integrity, the environment as a fictitious commodity, a double movement in the form of environmental movements and government regulation to protect the environment, and of course the economistic fallacy, the opposition of the health of the economy to the health of our planet. And I'll end with that. Thanks.